A very good afternoon to all. We are happy to welcome you to another episode of KCHR Intervention Series. I'd like to welcome Professor K.N. Ganesh, Chairperson KCHR, to this academic event. And I'd like to welcome Professor G. Arunima, Director KCHR, to this program, who will be presiding over the session later. We would like to extend our special thanks to Ms. Devangana Kalita and Ms. Natasha Narwal for agreeing to be part of KCHR's Intervention Series. Today, they will be speaking on the topic Beyond Crime and Punishment, Prisons, Justice and Women's Movement. Devangana Kalita is a feminist activist and a PhD scholar at the Center for Women's Studies, JNU. Her research work focuses on gender, memory and labor history. Natasha Narwal is a feminist activist and also a PhD scholar at the University of Warwick, UK. Her research focuses on gender, prisons, and carceral systems. Ms. Devangana and Ms. Natasha, we warmly welcome you to the series. I cordially welcome all the participants who have joined via Zoom and the KCHR team to this talk. At the end of the presentation, we'll have a question and answer session, and the participants can type their questions in the Q&A option. We'll read it out to the speaker and this will save time. If anyone wishes to be on the KCHR mailing list, please type in your email IDs in the chat box and it will be added to our mailing list. Now, I'd like to invite Professor G. Arunima to preside over the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Akshita. I am really so happy that we could organize this talk by Devangana and Natasha, whom I've known for many years now, because they were both our students. Natasha has very recently moved to the University of Warwick to do her PhD, and I'm really happy that she has done that. I'm also a little bit more fortunate than many others because I did have a chance to read the paper before. And I think it's a really important intervention because what it does to my mind, and of course, we will speak about all of these things at the end of the talk, is that it brings together a very difficult, immersive experience. It's a very, very difficult, immersive ethnography in some senses, but it's also so deeply reflective. And scholarly. And so I'm very excited that we can actually host this talk because I think it is very important that those of us to whom, questions about women's rights and women's movements and political rights and rights of freedom and the right to dissent and the right to peaceful protest mean probably far, far more than all the academic books in the world. It's important that, scholars, young scholars such as these, have the opportunity to speak in their own words about both a scholarly and a political concern. So I very warmly and very happily welcome you both. So you have an hour to present your paper, and we have usually an hour for discussion. But should you run over time, it doesn't matter. Don't get anxious. Just present your paper so that people hear what you have to say, and then we will have a discussion after that. Over to you.
Thank you, Arunima. Thank you to KCHR and Arunima for facilitating this talk and actually giving so much time so that we can actually lay out our points, because often we struggle because the time limit is so less. So as a lot of you might know, both Natasha and I were charged under the Draconian Unlawful Activities Prevention Act and charged as terrorists, and for our participation in the peaceful protests against the CAA, NPR, and NRC for equal citizenship. And both of us spent 13 months in one of South Asia's largest prison, in Tihar jail, in the women's prison in jail number 6. And in some senses, this paper also, which took us a while to write, actually, we've been out on bail for almost 2 years now, but to actually bring together our thoughts and to make sense sense of our experience also as activists in the space of the prison and the kind of reflections it made us have. And I think one of the things which struck us most was this, because we were also part of the women's collective Pinjra Tor and generally engaging with the history of the women's movement in India. So in that sense, the women's movement has had a long history of engagement in India with the law, with the judicial system, particularly with regard to, like, demanding various laws for recognizing various forms of sexual violence and domestic violence, which has also created a very important sphere of struggle. But our experience in prison also made us ask the question about, like, a similar rigorous engagement with the other, what lies on the other side, what happens in the prison, what are women's lives inside prison, who are the women coming into prison, and what we as as women's rights activists, as the women's movement, how we engage inside what happens within the four walls of prison. And so in some senses, this paper is also a kind of reflection of having witnessed the life of law, which is painstakingly lived inside the walls of prison. So there are, both Natasha and I will cover different aspects of the paper. So the section which I will deal with will interrogate the construction of crime and punishment and the workings of law, which to show how they flatten out the complexities of women's lives and render them criminal. Then I'll also try to demonstrate how women's defiance of Brahminical patriarchal norms often play a role in the nature of punishment she receives, and how in many cases the crime also that she comes to be accused of is often linked to these struggles. Then Natasha will kind of talk about how prisons are deeply gendered spaces and an extension of the patriarchal carceral state, and how often, reform and discipline in prison is about domesticating wayward women and restoring them back in familial lives as, obedient wives, daughters, or sisters. And finally, the final section where Natasha will build on more is about the need to interrogate the place and functions of prison and carceral punishments in our society, and also in how we conceptualize our movements to look at imaginations of justice that are, forms of justice which are more aligned to the kind of society we want to create and build. So I think the first thing which has also been talked about by many scholars and activists is the question about how the majority of our country's prison population is composed of people who come from historically marginalized castes or religious minorities. They are criminalized and jailed in numbers that are much higher compared to their share in the population at large. Like, if we just look at data, this is data from 2019. The percentage of prison population of scheduled castes is 22.43%, whereas their percentage in the population as per the 2011 census is 16.6%. Similarly, in the census, scheduled tribes are 8.6%, but they constitute 11.4% of the prison population. So that is something very jarring, which shows us that, how people from marginalized, and this is not just, this is successive years of the NCRB data has shown that people from working class, marginalized, and religious minorities are jailed in much higher numbers in our prisons. And the other very glaring aspect that comes through is how most of the prison population is also under trials. The latest data from 2021 with regard to women prisoners shows that 77.4% of women prisoners are under trials. So while Dalits, Adivasis, Muslims, and other religious minorities are much more likely to find themselves in prison, the path to justice and to get themselves out of prison also remains an elusive and unequal kind of process, given the high number of under trials that we see in our prisons. And during our experience, it was so stark. Like majority of women prisoners in prison do not have the resources to hire a private lawyer who can be, who can legally represent them. And almost all of them, most of them have to depend on the legal, like the legal aid system, the government legal aid system, which is so overburdened and so dysfunctional that to get any form of justice from that system is like a ridiculously long and slow process. And also just the legal system itself is so opaque for people, particularly for people who do not know to read and write. So a lot of our prison time was actually kind of spent in explaining to people how the legal process works, reading charge sheets, reading court orders, explaining to people what the charges against them were. So like, one is talking about such a opaque legal system where there is almost no mechanism for people to even understand. It's like once people find themselves in jail, it's like an unknown world out there. You don't know what is going to happen to your lives, when you are going to come out. And it's like small things. Someone who ended up in our barrack, she said, like, when she was kept in the isolation, because we were in prison during COVID time, when she was kept in isolation in her cell, one of the matrons had come to her and told her, put your thumbprint on this piece of paper. And she didn't, like, they didn't tell her what that piece of paper was, and she assumed, oh, maybe my bail has happened and I'll go out in a few days, whereas she didn't go out for like a month. And later on she found out that the paper that she was made to put her thumbprint on was basically a vakalatnama, which is basically when a lawyer has to represent you. It's the paper that you have to sign. So there are just so many different, like, even as people who are doing MPhil and PhD, when we were in prison, we found it so difficult to understand even what is going on in our cases. So just imagine it for people who can't even read and write, and how the system would seem so overwhelming and so opaque. And the other aspect which I want to kind of go into, what is this question of, besides these kind of structural challenges which are there in the criminal justice system itself, which kind of, uh, are so biased against people who come from lower castes, people who come from working class backgrounds, or people who are Muslims, or the Sikhs, or other religious minorities, is the fact that whenever a woman finds herself in prison or accused of any crime, they face trial not just for the crimes that they stand accused of, but they also have to bear the burden of being a woman who has committed a crime, where women comes to be defined primarily in accordance to Brahminical patriarchal values and norms. And it is also hence important to critically interrogate what comes to constitute a crime, and how, in the context of women, the notions of morality and deviance come to play an important role in the nature of punishment accorded to them. And this is something which is like, which is there from colonial times. Like the colonial judicial discourse, by focusing on Indian women's sexuality and its perceived immorality in the discussion of their crimes, sought to criminalize any deviance from patriarchal norms. Thus, the patriarchal impulses of the colonial state and the native Indian society came together in the making of the female criminal. The state and the law in post-colonial India continues to constitute the women criminal in terms of her perceived breach of moral and sexual codes of society. So in some ways, the woman criminal is both invisibilized and exceptionalized. She is invisibilized in the kind of like, discourse around prison, because the numbers of women criminals are women prisoners are much lower compared to male prisoners. So in terms of prison discourse, they are often invisibilized. But they are, however, exceptionalized as symbols of moral corruption and degradation of society. Women's bodies continue to be seen as bearers of honor of the community and nation, and thus the women criminal then becomes its biggest shame. So women are punished not just for their own crimes, but also punished as examples on the behalf of society for daring to defy its norms. Most women, particularly from marginalized communities who find themselves in prison, are as much prisoners of structural oppression as they are criminals under the ambit of law, where they come to be in transgression not just of the law, but of what society deems as being a good woman. Here, we would also like to kind of introduce this, to talk about how it's also not helpful to think in this kind of simplistic victim and criminal binary. Victim being someone who has been, falsely accused by the criminal justice system because of her refusal to obey patriarchal norms, versus the real criminals who have committed the most kind of heinous crimes. Because our effort is to move beyond this binary, to look at how law and criminal justice system fails to capture the complex and contradictory trajectories of women's lives as they both participate in and negotiate and struggle against structural oppression and inequality. And in this process, where they are both complicit in and also struggling against patriarchal structures, the nature of decisions that they make and the actions that they take play a role in why and how they find themselves in prison, and what even makes it possible for them to get out, if at all. And through the within this framework of the kind of questions that I have raised, I want to kind of talk about some of the life stories of some of the women we met in prison, whose lives we came to know very intimately of, and whom we have befriended and whom we are still in touch with. And they really kind of elucidate what the points which I had raised earlier. For instance, the names we have changed because to maintain anonymity. But I want to talk about the case of this young Muslim women from Northeast Delhi. Actually, it was such a joy joy for us, obviously not when, but to meet someone from that area when we were in prison. And we had been in prison already for like 6 months, and she had come in at that time bringing stories of, how people out there in the areas think about us, think about the protests, and they are, standing strong in support of us. And just to hear that behind the closed walls of prison was so kind of invigorating and strength giving for us. So Rukhsana was in prison accused of selling her girl child, and she had to spend many months in prison before she got bail. And when her bail was rejected by the magistrate court, I just quote from the court order what it said. At the outset, it is pertinent to mention that an offense like the one involved in the present case is of such nature that shakes the collective conscience of society. The offense of selling and buying a minor child by the mother herself strikes at the bottom of morality of the society. If acts of selling and buying is left to continue, then our nation as a whole will fail. And since it was a girl child, the judge goes on to further accuse of her of human trafficking. So in one grand stroke of law was erased the many struggles and hardship that marked the realities of Rukhsana's troubled life. Condemned as a deviant mother, her alleged inability to fulfill the duties of motherhood was made to bear the risk of the entire nation's failure and the brunt of the society's collective conscience. Rukhsana was punished not only for selling her child, but also for doing so as a mother. In the lexicon of law, the only lens through which Rukhsana's life decisions and actions could be looked at was her presumed criminality in failing to be a good mother and a moral woman. So this was, how the judgment looked at Rukhsana's life. Whereas, because she was in the same ward as us. Rukhsana comes from she lives from an extremely poor working class background. She lives in the Basti in one area in Northeast Delhi. She was already a mother of 3 children, and when she got pregnant, she was very worried about how she will fend for another child. And her husband was alcoholic, and she would often face domestic violence from him. And so she was like, I can't rely on this person. She considered abortion, but her husband was strictly against it because, it's prohibited in Islam. So finally, she decided that she'll go through the pregnancy, but she will give the daughter up for adoption to a friend of hers at work who was a Hindu, and who had been wanting a child for a long time but had been unable to conceive. There was no financial transaction involved in the whole process. And even for Rukhsana, it was a very painful process because the thing of giving away her child led to a lot of feelings of guilt and trauma for her. But but this is not a decision she could reach with her husband. So finally, when she actually gave the child to her friend, her husband rushed to the police station to file a complaint against Rukhsana and her friend regarding kidnapping of the child. But obviously, a Muslim man going into a police station had to face the wrath of the state police machinery that is premised on criminalization of Muslim lives. So the police, instead of registering his complaint, arrested him, made him the main accused in the case, and arrested Ruxana's friend Neha and her husband and brother. So all these people were brought together into this case. And caught in the middle of all of this was the little child who was barely 1 month old. And it's quite ironical because when he was rejecting his bail, the judge said, when the judge was rejecting Ruxana's bail, he said, the law mandates the best interest of the child has to be seen and maintained at all times. But what was the effect of his judgment was that the child spent the first 8 months of her life in prison. And also how, like, the state, the legal system, the state and the police machinery coming into people's lives, how they have also ruptured relationships which have actually been built over such a long period of time, and relationships that actually cross boundaries of religion, of caste. So for instance, initially when the child was in prison, both Ruxana and her friend Neha would look after the child. But soon what happened was that, Neha started facing a lot of pressure from her family, saying that, you have brought so much disrepute to us. And the relationship between the two friends also became full of tension. And Neha got bail before Ruxana, and her bail condition said that she cannot be in touch with her co-accused, which is Ruxana. So in that sense, like, the state, police, and judicial machinery came to completely dismantle and destroy what was quite a beautiful friendship between two women. So that's the point we were trying to make, how the complexities and the different dynamics and contradictions of women's lives, and how when law comes to read it in particular ways, it completely destroys relationships. And so while Ruxana was punished for being a Muslim woman for transgressing the established norms of motherhood and care, there's Fernanda, who was a young Brazilian woman who we met in prison, she was basically she was caught under the Narcotics Act, the NDPS Act, and accused under that. And basically she pleaded guilty because she only understood Portuguese and did not speak any Hindi or any English. And the Brazilian embassy told her that if you plead guilty, then she was pregnant. She only found out when she was arrested that she's pregnant. So the Brazilian embassy told her that if you plead guilty and do not go through a long process of trial, we will transfer you and the child to a Brazilian prison, and then you can do your conviction in a Brazilian prison, and at least your child will get to be with the grandmother who can take care of him. So however, when Fernanda's conviction was being argued, she had to kind of, her lawyer, who was also a legal aid lawyer who barely knew the case, the only argument he made was to ask leniency from the judge by stressing that she is in a family way, and that she has 4 kids already, and how that she did not know about her pregnancy when she was doing this. So basically, and that was one of the main factors that led to her getting simple imprisonment and not rigorous imprisonment. And in the meanwhile, even though she pleaded guilty so that she could be transferred, so her kid when he's born, doesn't have to spend time in prison, that has not happened. And the child is going to be 5 years this year, and he is still in Tihar jail number 6, while the files of Fernanda's transfer is stuck between various bureaucratic processes between the Indian and the Brazilian government. And then I would like to bring up the case of someone who was also a co-inmate in prison, who is infamous as Delhi's only women gangster, Lady Dawn. Her sex work business is supposed to have flourished in the context of the new sexual realities of post-liberalization India, where she was able to tap into an emerging market of middle-class men with extra cash and a newfound freedom to spend time away from home. But this Lady Dawn's portrayal in the media, once we came out, we searched YouTube videos, and it was just so abysmal in terms of the way in which her life was dramatized, and how in mainstream media, there's both a fetishization and a condemnation of her life, calling her a notorious flesh trader, sex racketeer, unrepentant pimp, gangster's girlfriend, habitual offender, all kinds of names like that. And she was also denounced because she has a lavish lifestyle. She is a woman who smokes and has multiple lovers who are dangerous men who were all killed in police encounters, which apparently because of tip-offs by her. So, and in prison, we weren't allowed to interact much because we were all high security prisoners. But in kind of, every now and then you could manage to find ways to talk to one another. And she was pregnant with her first husband, a small time gangster and carjacker who was killed in an encounter by the UP police. With no financial security, she was left with the responsibility of not just caring for her newborn, but also for her mother, sister, and two brothers. She started working in a parlor and soon after became a sex worker. Over the last 2 decades, Seema, name changed, has been arrested multiple times under various cases, including the stringent MOPOCA for organized crime. According to her, she has been falsely flamed by the police every time. She has always maintained that she has never forcefully pushed any woman into doing galat kaam. For her and her girls, sex work provided an opportunity for a better life when faced with difficult circumstances. In a couple of rare media appearances in 2019, when she was out on parole, Seema has spoken of being gang raped in 2014 and receiving threats to her and her son's life. She accused the police of shielding her perpetrators. In 2020, Seema was convicted to 24 years of rigorous imprisonment in the case of trafficking a minor girl and is currently serving her sentence in Tihar jail. I mean, we don't want to delve into the complex debates around sex work in this context, but what we wanted to highlight here is, what Seema's conviction order said. So the judge proclaimed that the shameful deeds of Seema deprives her of any leniency from the courts. He goes on to assert that the person, irrespective of gender, who does such horrific and terrible acts has no right to live in a civilized society, and for her, the best place is to live within the four boundaries of jail. The convict crossed all the limits to be called a woman and deserves severest punishment provided under law. So basically, what the judgment implicitly does is to establish that the crimes that Seema stood accused of, she needs to be given no leniency, as which often women prisoners are granted. And this leniency should not be allowed because she stood in transgression of all boundaries that define a good woman. She deserved harshest punishment for her crimes, but she deserved that also for doing so as a woman. So it was not just her crime, but her womanhood, which was also on trial. Similarly, talking about how the earlier point which one made about the complex trajectories of women's life and how they find themselves in prison and how that is linked to their the way in which they challenge Brahminical patriarchal norms. So actually, one of our first barrack mates in prison was this 20-year-old Hindu woman, Babita. She came from a working class locality in North Delhi, and she fell in love with a Muslim boy when she was a teenager, for which when her parents found out, they locked her up, they beat her up very badly. Her father was like, he really hit her badly, and she was put under almost like house arrest. So one day she kind of ran away from home and eventually started living with her boyfriend. But leaving her family meant that she didn't have any money. She had to leave school because she was unable to pay the fees. And the kind of estrangement from her family led to deep kind of mental traumas through which she tried to seek refuge from by she got into what is called smack. It's a form of black tar heroin, which she also became addicted to. And then she also she got, through her boyfriend, she became involved in youth gangs and started engaging in theft to earn a living. And actually many young women who came into prison on these petty thefts had similar stories where during their teenage years they have done something which is transgression of kind of patriarchal or caste norms, which has upset their family, because of which they have had to kind of leave home and then found themselves in these lives of what are deemed as criminals. And Geeta also again didn't have a lawyer through the legal aid system. When she finally got bail, she had already spent more than her maximum sentence that you get for stealing a mobile phone. And actually, even after she got bail, she couldn't go out outside prison for another 3-4 months because she could not furnish a surety, a bail surety, someone who pays your bail amount and as well as gives an address who stands as surety for you. When the jail authorities called up her father, he said, please keep her in prison for as long as you can keep her so that she reforms, and my daughter is dead for me. So, what we see here is that the way the criminal justice system itself also is designed, when a woman has to go, somehow manages to get through all the hurdles and finally gets bail to actually get out of prison, there's the way the process is designed, it is such that you have to again become dependent on oppressive structures of marriage or family or other exploitative relationships one might have broken away from or wish to do so. Actually, even today, another jail friend, she got bail 3 months back, and only for 1 month she's got interim bail, but she has lost contact with all her family. There was no one to stand surety for her, and she kept giving money to various people through jail contacts, some 30,000-40,000 rupees, which she earned through laboring inside prison, which she had to kind of give to different people for someone to just stand as surety for her. So now there's just one last point which I want to make before moving on to Natasha's, is this thing of, how this point which we are making about, interrogating the nature of crime and also looking at how, how women's defiance of patriarchal norms affects the nature of punishment they get, and looking at the complex trajectories of women's life. I think for us also, it became a challenging question when we thought about women prisoners who are accused under laws that our own movements have fought hard to be recognized as crimes, such as dowry deaths or caste atrocities. For instance, when the barrack that we were put in prison, it was opposite the barrack of, that barrack was called Ye Bahuvali ka barrack hai. Basically, women who are accused accused of murdering their daughter-in-laws or being somehow aiding the that of their daughter-in-laws. So here we want to go back to the point made earlier about moving beyond a victim-criminal binary to confront women's participation and complicity in patriarchal or caste violence, and to make space for the possibility that even in such cases, the trajectory of a woman's life may simultaneously inhabit positions of enacting violence, experiencing oppression, and demonstrating defiance. So, for instance, I would like to talk about someone whom we met in prison, who actually, because she was living just in the opposite barrack, became quite a close friend. She was a Dalit woman whom in this paper we have called Geeta Devi. She, along with her son and husband, were charged and imprisoned under 498A after her daughter-in-law committed suicide. Geeta Devi would spend a lot of time in our barrack as she was determined to become educated during her prison time. As a child, she loved studying, but she could not continue her education as it was deemed useless for girls, and soon after she had to get married. Whatever time she managed to find in between laboring inside prison, she would dedicate to reading and writing, and was one of the most frequent visitors at the jail library. Even at night after lockup, while other inmates watched TV serials, she would diligently sit down to study and would call out to us across the barrack whenever she had a question or a doubt. In a play that we directed inside prison for March 8 celebrations in 2021, Geeta Devi played the role of Savitri Bai. From initially being very hesitant because she had never acted on stage before, she delivered an amazingly confident performance. She had read about Savitri Bai in a feminist magazine edition that we had located in the jail library. She felt extremely proud and inspired to have played that role. She also began to go around the jail ward randomly humming Tor Tor Ke Bandhano Ko, breaking the shackles of bondage, which we had learned together during the play. So, women like Geeta Devi, like for instance, how working class or lower caste men are more likely to be convicted in cases of violence against women. Similar was the scenario with women prisoners accused of these crimes too. So it's pertinent for the women's movement to recognize that the laws that have come as a result of our struggles, while providing an important space for women to fight against gender-based violence, have also simultaneously empowered the state police machinery with more power. Unless there is constant scrutiny and demanding of accountability with regard to what is happening to women's lives inside prison and under our criminal justice system, whether there is access to adequate legal representation or not, even the laws that we have fought for will continue to be used to further criminalize, marginalize women's lives and actions. And we did meet many women like that in prison as well. Like there was this very young, she was just 20 years old, one young girl who was picked up from the hospital by the police. She had come with a very young child as well, and the police didn't even tell her what is the case, what has happened. She was picked up from the hospital and dropped in jail, and she basically, her sister-in-law had committed suicide, and she was living in her husband's house, and she was the youngest daughter. Like there is very little chance that she might have been had any power to influence the crime that she stood accused of. And it, even for her, it took a long time, even with the baby, for her to finally get bail. So we are not arguing that women cannot inflict or be complicit in violence, but that the carceral power of the state overwhelmingly criminalizes already marginalized lives and does not leave any room for the complexities of what goes on in the constitution of a crime. Neither does carceral punishments provide any space for reflection and understanding by such women to be able to see and challenge the structures of oppression and their own participation in them. What it does, it just fixes them in their positions of being criminals, while also absolving the role of the state and law in furthering structures of oppression which lead to and perpetuate such violence. So now Natasha will move on to the later part of the paper.
Hi, everyone. Am I audible?
Yes,
Yeah,
you
it
are.
is.
You are.
Thank you. Thank you, Devangana, for laying all of that. And I will draw on that as well as bring out certain other aspects which we wanted to talk about in our paper. So I'll just start with a small anecdote. One evening in Tihar, as we were arguing with the matron, as we often used to, about there is a specific timing of being locked up inside your barracks called the lockup time, which is according to the jail rules is related to sunset. So whenever the sun sets, but of course there is a lot of discretionary power of the prison staff of when they choose to do it. So it used to be a site of contestation every day. And and we were arguing that this is not the time for lockup yet. And she very candidly told us that, think of this place, the prison, as your sasural. And as you are supposed to adjust in your sasural, you have to adjust here also. You cannot expect everything which, to function according to your wishes. And that really like brought home to us the interconnected nature of prisons and the carceral space with the patriarchal state, the family, community, kinship networks, and how they all come together even within the walls of prison to discipline women. And that is so integral to the even the imagination of the space of the prison. So I want to just elaborate on this point a little further. And so on the one hand, actually, in the imaginations of the prison, of building of prisons, of imagining the space inside and the prisoner, women actually occupy a very marginal position. The prisons are built for men as the archetype, but the anxieties, especially the sexual anxieties around women and their bodies, actually occupies a much more disproportionate amount of space in the imagination of discipline inside the prison and its organization. And it is there, like, it has been there historically since prisons have come to occupy such an important space in our society and in our criminal justice system. The Committee for Jail Reforms of 1919, which is like a kind of a foundational text for organizations of prisons and prison discipline and reforms within the country. It though again women prisoners had a very marginal presence in the terms of their overall population of the prisoners, but it kind of emphasizes the need to imprison women in separate buildings or separate parts, and I quote, in a manner as to prevent their seeing, conversing, or holding any kind of intercourse with any male prisoner. So from this, what I'm trying to say is that even when their actual numbers, actual presence was and continues to be marginal inside the prisons in the overall scheme, the anxiety around the bodies, anxiety around controlling of sexuality occupies a much stronger space in the imagination of the prison discipline and in the way the prison is organized spatially. So for a lot of women prisoners, they are housed in not separate women prisons, but within separate enclosures of the male prisons. And these special sections are additionally fortified, and they restrict mobility of the women prisoners further, even inside the prison, because they cannot be seen by any male prisoner, or they should not see anybody. So, that these kind of sections kind of become like, you can see like the gendered nature of restriction of mobility and the security protection nexus, which gets reinforced, that it is for women's security, that you have to be further curtailed even when you are inside prison, so that you can be secure. And in the separate women prison as well, which are actually just 32 out of 1,319 prisons in total in India, these prisons, though there is no a very immediate threat of the male presence, because there are no male prisoners inside that building, that threat kind of still governs the everyday mobility, the everyday discipline of women prisoners inside as a kind of phantom, which is just always present. And to just give a small example, in Tihar, though we were also imprisoned in time of the lockdown, where anyways that was also being used to curtail all the rights and even the right of mobility within the prison premises. But there was a particular reason for, like, there was only this one lawn inside the prison which was prohibited for women prisoners to go. And that was the only space where you could actually go for, like, doing some physical exercise or just, having some sense of an open space. And people were not allowed to go to that lawn. And when we inquired that, has it been like this forever, or is it just because of the COVID protocols? And we were told that actually women prisoners are not allowed in this lawn unless until, of course, there is an official function, because the women prison is surrounded by the men's prisons. And from the watchtowers of those prisons, there are male guards present. So if women are allowed to go in this lawn, they can be seen by those guards of the male prisons. And that is why you're not allowed to go there. So that also was really a kind of a striking example of that, even within a women's prison, where there is no actual physical threat of physical violence or encounter with the male body, just its presence, or the threat of its presence, or the threat of being seen by the male gaze, kind of how it operates in the everyday of the prison discipline. And also the ordering, again, one is this kind of ordering of the body through restriction and surveillance. The other part is of how, you know, how the body is constituted, how it is presented, and that is also a very, very integral part of the prison regime, and that is also a very, very gendered regime, as of course, like, you know, the emphasis on the kind of clothing that you are allowed in prison. It's not that, you know, male prisoners are allowed some extraordinary or extravagant kind of clothing, but the kind of surveillance is much more on what women wear, and especially, like, you know, the idea of the dress for convicts who are convicted of a crime is, and the kind of life they're supposed to lead of, you know, a life of they're supposed to wear white, so which is kind of a symbolic of a life of chastity. And of course the punishment is based on a regime of rigorous labor, so it's almost very similar to the idea of widowhood, that, you know, as a widow, the kind of life you're supposed to live, which, you know, your desiring body is supposed to be, you know, you have to forego of that, of any kind of desire, even of, like, you know, clothing or presenting your body in a certain way, and embody the idea of a very pious or a chaste life, which is also based on just your life has to be devoted to service and labor. And that is exactly what is the idea of the convict woman inside the prison. And of course, the sexual desire, it is supposed to be completely, like, non-existent. And any kind of sexual expression is heavily clamped down, but also interestingly never named. So if inmates are found, in sexual relationships with each other, or even in consensual relationships with the prison staff, they are heavily punished, but never in the name. The act is never named. They are punished for, you know, supposedly something else. So it never kind of enters the record of the official text of prisons and its regimes. And that is also kind of, you know, there used to be a rumor that they mix something, some kind of medicine in the water, so that prisoners stop being, you know, desiring, their sexual desire is curbed through medicines, or something is mixed in the food. So this kind of anxiety is always circulating even within the prisoners, but it is never named as such. And that also kind of tells us that how threatening it is to the prison disciplinary regime, that they cannot even acknowledge it officially. And another way in which the women prisoners are especially, like, you know, disciplined in a very gendered way is the kind of skills, the kind of opportunities they are given in terms of the reformative discourse of the prison, that, you know, we are reforming the prisoners, we are giving them opportunities for learning some new skills, education, so that when they go out in the society, they can, you know, build a life. But what kind of opportunities, what kind of skills building is given to women prisoners is again comes from the idea of what kind of woman is being, you know, they want to create. So women prisoners will only get to, you know, learn the art of or the skill of knitting or stitching clothes or making candles. So that is the only kind of skills they can learn, which actually does not give you much of opportunities of employment post your incarceration. It can only, you know, it is more informed by what is a good woman supposed to learn and how she's supposed to behave, so that you can be reintegrated in your roles in the familial structure, rather than, you can build a life otherwise. Um, and same goes for the educational opportunities. I mean, though of course it kind of varies from prison to prison, because there are also state subjects, and it's also very, very dependent on, you know, what kind of, so if you get like a prison administrator who's slightly more concerned or more involved, so you might get, they might introduce certain new things or other things, but that this is, you know, a kind of the overall picture we are talking about. So another thing which we learned was, again, it was during the pandemic, and most of the activities were suspended. So suddenly when we saw a lot of young women of our inmates, they were studying for some exam, and we were very curious that as students, as you know, so what is happening, what are they studying for? And when we asked them, so all of them had one exam which they had, for some course they had taken from IGNOU, which they were allowed to. And so we got really excited and we asked them, so okay, what courses have you taken? And every one of them said home science. And we were very confused that why all of you have taken this course, like, you know. And they told us this was the only thing which was offered to us. So that was, I mean, I'm not saying that this is something which happens every time or across all prisons. I'm sure like in certain, and even in Tihar at other times, something other might also be made available. But also it like, this is something which kind of brought, it was more of a symbolic, which encapsulated the impulse of the prison disciplinary regime for us, that this is in terms of restricted options, what would you you know, push for from the administrative side is something like this. Whereas it's not like the women prisoners do not want to do other things. So, you know, they would, especially like as prisoners, as somebody who have been embroiled in the process of law, a lot of people wanted to learn about law, you know, or like wanted to learn like computers, or wanted to learn other skills which they thought would be much more useful for them, but they were not made available for them. Or say facilities of sports which were still running in the men's prison even during the pandemic, but were completely stopped in the women's prisons. So these are just giving, like, you know, idea of the texture of the disciplinary regime and the spatial organization of the prison, and how all of that is also gendered in its everyday nature. And another very, very important tool of this discipline which we found is wages. That, I mean, this, everybody knows that the regime of, you know, of punishment inside prison is very much based on labor, right? So whenever somebody is sentenced, you hear even from your films and you know, popular culture, that somebody has been sentenced to these many years of rigorous imprisonment or with rigorous labor, and the image of, you know, prisoners breaking stones and grinding flour inside. So the labor is very much part of the imagery of the prisoners, and it is true for the prisoner's life that labor is a very, very integral part of it, even for under trial prisoners who have not been convicted, but to survive inside. And as Devangana has already mentioned, that our prisons are full of people who are from the marginalized backgrounds of our society, who do not have the means, who do not have the family support or economic support, who will send them money inside prison. So they have to earn their own living while even being inside. And that is why it is becomes very important for them to find work and do the work inside prison, which is very, very minimally paid. So there is no concept of minimum wage. It is completely dependent on the prison administration, what they decide to pay a prisoner. And so according to the prison statistics 2021, the average wage for skilled labor inside prisons is rupees 111. For semi-skilled, it is rupees 95. For unskilled, it is rupees 87 per day. And this is an average, but there are prisons where it kind of varies to even rupees 20 a day. Delhi, the state of Delhi is actually pays the highest amount of wages, equivalent to minimum wages, but they introduced a system of cutting maintenance costs, which is as high as 63% of your wages for the unskilled labor, 58% for semi-skilled, and 52% for skilled labor. So more than half of your wage is gone for maintaining the prison. So you're made to pay for your own incarceration. And so apart from bizarreness of that, the point what I'm trying to make is such low wages also are a tool of disciplining. Especially it becomes even more heightened in case of women prisoners, because they are responsible not for just their own selves, but they often have to support children who are there with them inside the prisons or outside the prisons. So they have to take up more and more work because the wages are so low. So to make up income for their own survival and for their children's survival, they have to take up more work or work for longer hours. So most of their day, from the time when the barracks are open, the locks are open, and then from the time the locks are, you're locked up again, they are working to earn their survival for themselves and for their children. And also for a lot of women who have spent a long time in prison, they're even abandoned by their families. So then they also have to work to support themselves, not just for their everyday survival, but to pay lawyers, to pay for their bail sureties, to have savings so that when they come out of prison, they can, have something to fall back upon. And not having any of these things because of these minuscule wages also then ends up enmeshing them further in either remaining inside prisons, or even when coming out, to rely on those same exploitative networks of either the family or enter into other extractive relationships. And there is, of course, then direct, apart from these sites, and also these are forms of violence. But also there is the threat always of the direct violence within prison, which is, maybe on though male prisons are much more violent spaces, but there is also a lot more violent contestation between, say, the prisoners and the prison administration in male prisons. It's not a very, not to say that not to deny the power of the prison administration in those prisons, but what I'm trying to say is that it is the even very small perceived indiscipline from women prisoners is much more heavily clamped down by the prison authorities in female prisons, because they are supposed to be more docile subjects. So any kind of expression of a breach of discipline is much more heavily clamped. I'll just give one example of this, that when we were inside and it had been I think just a month of our incarceration, suddenly one day, we heard this very jarring sound of a siren ringing throughout the prison, and we just did not know what was happening. And though we were still in our isolation period, but the prisoners who were not, everybody started to get locked up, and prison staff came with their sticks and everything and just locked everyone up, and without telling us anything what is going on. And so later, gradually, we got to know that actually there was a bunch of African prisoners who were protesting for their right to bail, which was given in times of COVID to other prisoners, certain other categories of prisoners, as measures of decongestion of prisons. And they were also demanding the same right, as they were refused blanketly, like no foreign prisoner was supposed to get that interim bail for COVID. And so that was very, very heavily clamped down by the prison administration. Male guards were called from other prisons, and various African prisoners, women prisoners were beaten up brutally, even those who were not part of the protest. Anybody who they would see as, a Black African woman, just even, and one of the prisoners who eventually died due to that violence, she was not even part of the protest. She had just gone to the kitchen to get her food. And of course, then there was brutal suppression of that information. People were not given medical attentions. They were just transferred to other prisons. And because it was pandemic, courts were not functioning. And these prisoners, because they do not have any families outside, nobody got to know. Only later, some newspapers or organizations picked up the news, but it came in the media, but not much could be done because the kind of, again, the impunity the prison administration has. So from that is why what Devangana also pointed out, that as women rights activists, as feminist activists, we need to engage with what is happening in our prisons, because they are very much part of the network of society as institutions. They're not some kind of remote institution which is cut off from the rest of the society, where people are just thrown into for controlling crime. These are very inherently linked to all the structures of oppression, of violence with which we deal in our society. And prisons are also sites of these such violence and this oppression in a much more exasperated form. But the penal regime, the administration enjoys much more impunity because nobody is looking at them. They are, we are also kind of caught up in the blindness which is created by the state towards prisons and prisoners, that this is something distinct from your everyday life as you're living. And so you do not need to think about that in your everyday life and in your everyday struggles. And so I think I've taken a lot of time already, but I'll just briefly just make some last points. That as I was saying, that how we need to see how prisons are also very fundamental in that sense to our functioning of the society, to organization of the society, and also organization of our lives. Like it kind of orders that what is a desirable life to lead, and whose lives are not desirable, who can be just thrown into these prisons. And also we need to, as Devangana had kind of demonstrated in the earlier section, that how the crime is constructed, and when a punishment is pronounced, what kind of all the considerations that are going into that. So that also makes, I think we should from that take the cue also to see that, whose injury is being punished here, who is the injured when the law is meting out these punishments. Is it the individual who has been wronged, or the perceived notions of sexuality, heteronormativity, or the structures of oppression which orders a society? That those are the ones which are threatened, and that is why such the state comes down so heavily on punishing certain acts. From that, again, we need to see how hegemonic the idea of punishment has become to the notions of justice through that we cannot, like, when we think of justice, we kind of have to ask for punishment by law, which involves incarceration, which involves people to go through all these all these kinds of oppression. And so in the sense that what I'm trying to say is, I think we need to also interrogate our own investments in demanding of punishments, in demanding a certain kind of retribution. But within that, again, we need to see that whose injury are we then talking about? Who is the injured here? And to disentangle our notions of justice, our imaginations of justice, by that we are not saying that can be some simple outside of law, that, there's just something we just need to now get out of the legal discourse or law as such and find something else. But also, I think what we're saying is we need to change the terms of engagement with law, and also see it as not the rational, coherent system which is just punishing crime, but also open it up and see how it is constituting crime, how it is constituting punishment, and how embroiled we have become in its imagination of justice, that we as movements, as people who actually want to create a society without violence, without these structures of oppression, end up being entangled and enhancing the state's punitive powers through our own movements also.
Thank you so much. Actually,
Thank you, Ms. Devangana and Ms. Natasha, for the interesting presentation. Now the floor is open for question answer sessions. Please type your questions in the Q&A option. We'll read it out to the speaker. Ma'am, would you like to respond now?
no, I'd be happy to hear if other people have questions, and if there are people who feel it's very difficult for them to type, perhaps if they would keep their questions brief, could they use the raise hand option?
Yeah. We'll wait for 2 minutes that the others can type the questions.
If there are people typing, yeah. So, okay, so just to start you guys off, thank you so much. That was, when I was reading it, I was really struck by so many different kinds of elements in the kinds of issues that you're actually raising. And I was also struck by the ways in which you wanted to think about this period and your own experience. Because, in 21, very early in 21, soon after many of you were picked up, people I knew, students and so on, I started reading some of the biographies and autobiographies that were coming out at that time, and they were all written in very different kinds of ways. And I do have a draft piece, which I'm very happy to share with you at some point, just to hear from you what you think. So at that stage, I was reading Anjum Habib and Kobat Gandhi and, the man who wrote Beguna Kaidi, Abdul Wahid Sheikh. I was reading them, and and when I was reading your paper, I was very struck, particularly because each of those expresses this experience in very different kinds of language and different kinds of framing for very understandable sets of reasons. But particularly in relation to Anjum Habib's piece, memoir, and your piece, I was very struck by the way in which you are reflecting about the manners in which this punitive regime affects issues like sexuality, and the way in which that is being, there's a kind of almost legitimate policing of an already policed aspect of women's lives. And that's not something that she addresses. Perhaps it wasn't so relevant, I don't know. But do you think that there are also generational kinds of considerations in the ways in which women prisoners speak about these kinds of things? And I was thinking about another piece that you people had written earlier for the press, which was, I think, written while you were still in prison. which was published. And that had a sense of the everyday. And the structure of the everyday was being recounted very differently. And I wondered, what is it about the kinds of spaces of interaction between the women and younger women and older women and others whom you met, in terms of the kinds of things that got spoken about, or the kinds of things they wanted to know from you, for example?
Natasha, you want to? Or?
I'll join in, you go start.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. No, I think Anjum's experience, because I also haven't actually read the whole memoir, but I read some part, like just last week only I was reading. And her experience is also because as a Kashmiri Muslim woman prisoner,
Absolutely.
and also we were one very thing which is actual, which we were in some senses also lucky about, was that we were not put in the NIA UAPA barrack where most of the particularly Kashmiri Muslim women prisoners are put, but we were put in one of the common barracks, which also allowed a lot more like chances of interaction with people and connect, because the jail is, and they did this particularly to Safura and Gulfisha as well. Like as soon as they managed to get out of their period of isolation, the administration just spread the word that, you know, they are terrorists, they are this, they are that, to unse baat mat kiya karo ye wo. But when we were in the common barracks, and also once we came, there was also this thing of like, you know, these non-Muslims who, they were very confused what we were, and like, you know, these Muslims together in the same case, and then people would be curious and try to talk to us. And also once, you know, you were like, you know, you were writing people's applications, helping them with their legal process, this, that, people also came to connect and trust you in ways which when you are isolated in the high security ward, it is much more difficult to do. Like, you know, it is, and yeah, and I guess there is also Anjum's particularized location, which through which certain things were looked at in certain ways. I think she had a very with the particularly with the African foreigners, she had quite a tense relationships as well. Which I think Sabha, when she translated her text, she was also felt a discomfort in that, but she did, like, you know. So in that sense, and actually in terms of we were obviously there was, you know, with the younger women there were more like openness about talking about various things, but actually as our barrack mates we mostly lived with actually women older to us. And in some sense I think even that everyday living experience allowed for conversations to happen, which, you know, how even as activists when we are participating in various movements, you are kind of careful about how you present yourself, so that, you know, there are sometimes you have to restrict yourself for doing certain things so that, you know, you can operate in a movement space, or like, you know, you, in terms of reaching certain topics, you kind of, you know, you take your time to kind of think about but I think that experience of incarceration in the barrack really allowed for conversations to flow in ways which was even unexpected for us, whether it was questions of like, you know, various, maybe Natasha can elaborate on.
Yeah, I mean, I also think that only, like, you know, particular locations of not just how we were kept in prison, but also I think something to do with where we were also coming from, right? So, and of course, like where how we were kept in prison, as Devangana said, it was very important to enable these kinds of having these relationships and building certain kind of conversations, which also just did not happen overnight. I mean, initially there was a lot of hesitation around even us, that, you know, what kind of case is this, and how is this, like, yeah. But as the experience, the everyday living kind of then enables you to create another space also where various kinds of conversations can happen. But for us also, I think it was coming from a space of, like, you know, building collectives, building movements, and being part of them, and deriving our sense of purpose also from that was also like we also kind of very consciously invested much more in those spaces as well. That it is almost like, I mean, not to say that other people did not, but especially like for a lot of people from a certain caste class background or economic backgrounds who do end up in prison, they do tend to not keep their distance from certain kind of people. But I think what I'm trying to say is that how we also think or were inhabiting the world politically outside, that also informed our building of these spaces and conversations inside. And of course, like not to say that that kind of did away with the caste or class privileges we had as prisoners even at that time. And people would also see you as, okay, these people can help me, like, okay, understand my chart sheet, or they can help me in writing my application or navigate the negotiations with the prison administration much better than I can do on my own. So there were but around that, then also that space enables you to have conversations which otherwise you would not be having. I don't know if that kind of
No, absolutely.
Yeah, and also I think, yeah. Also, people also kind of see, like, have their own ways of understanding difference also. Like, so often most middle or upper class prisoners who end up in prison either are political prisoners, quote unquote, and then or are in dowry cases or in financial fraud. Otherwise, and there are very few in number. And mostly whenever there is someone from a particular kind of like middle class background, they will usually have, some, so they will I mean, you don't have cash in prison, but you buy items from the prison canteen, and like, for washing your clothes, for cleaning your barrack, your toilets, they have some other inmate doing that. And when people would see us doing those things on our own, that would be very confusing. So they would be like, tum kisi ko rakh kyun nahi rahe ho, kya ho raha hai, ye wo. So in various those kind of things also, which as like, I think, political activists, the way in which you are kind of connecting and relating to people, where even because it's not like even the prison is a kind of equalizing space in terms of snatching various privileges from you. It's still many of those hierarchies which exist in society still exist in the prison as well. But how within that space also one is working towards undoing certain things, and in terms of connecting and building collectivity. So I think those things
I think there's some questions in the chat box,
Yeah.
perhaps those. Akshita, would you like to read those out?
Yeah. Bibi Muideen has asked, even the police women inside the prisons treat female prisoners in a negative way. Shouldn't we start the reformation from inside?
Yeah.
should we
Should I read?
should we take a bunch of questions together, or should we respond?
It's up to you.
Yeah,
The
you can.
questions are there in the chat box.
Okay.
You can see that, I think.
Yeah.
There are a couple of them. So if you want to take those together, that's perfectly fine. Or if you want to answer them one after another, that's also perfectly fine.
I can see only two actually. Are there more?
Yeah, no, only two questions. I'll read the second one also. While studying women prison, what sort of approach does one need to take care? Because there is this inherent sense of notion that they are defaulters and have to go through punishment, even though there are a lot of other perspective that needs to be understood. Thank you.
Natasha, you want to start?
Okay. The first question, I mean, it's not about just starting from inside or the outside, and what we are trying to say is that the prison is, a constitutive of all the kind of structures of oppression which constitute our society as well. So it's not for us, it's not a question for inside or outside, because we are complicating that boundary also, that, it's not, prisons are not just some self-contained institutions which have to be looked at separately. But having said that, of course, like it is an important dimension of if what is called prison reforms, that the prison staff has to be sensitized. But the what happens is, when you just look at it from that lens, that okay, prison staff needs to be sensitized, or they are have to be taught to be looking at prisoners a certain way, without without kind of going into the structural dimensions of why they are and that is why we spoke about how the disciplinary regime is constructed inside the prison. Without addressing that, without going into that, you cannot expect just people to, from their own conscience or heart, just start being, it's not about being them being nice or not nice, but what are they supposed to do by what is mandated from them, by the prison regime itself, has to be looked at comprehensively. But having said that, there is nothing, like, we're not saying that this should not be part of that, and there has to be constant trainings of prison staff, and also not just, I mean, prisons are also, we have to also look at that prisons are also really, really understaffed. So the prison staff are also actually very overburdened, and that also leads to a lot of, what is called extrajudicial violence, or instances of, like, conflict between the prison and the staff, because they are also supposed to manage much more than they are mandated to. So there are a lot of aspects of that, how the staff functions inside the prisons has to be looked at. Devangana, you want to add?
Yeah. I mean, I guess for the one second, I'll go back to for the second question, in terms of what kind of approach to take in terms of, like, studying women's prisons, when the criminals are often looked at defaulters who need to go through the punished in certain ways. So I guess through our paper also, we are trying to think about, like, different ways of studying the women's prison, where, like, fundamentally you question the whole idea of a criminal itself. Who is a woman criminal? Like, that, say that the story we talked about, Ruxana's life. So Ruxana is supposed to be a criminal because she tried to sell her young girl child. But, that's her crime. But actually going into listening to women's stories, foregrounding the stories and the complexities of women's life, and then talking about, what is this crime that we are talking about? So, what did Ruxana really, did she, okay, she sold her baby, but, or she gave away her baby to someone else. Why did she have to how, why did she decide to give away her baby? And was she punished for selling her baby, or was she punished for being a mother who did not want to keep her baby because she wanted a better life for her baby? That is not, like, there are so many different angles to that story, which that charge of her as a criminal who tried to sell her baby does not kind of capture at all. Or even things like, someone who has been accused of committing a crime which they admit they committed, but, what are the circumstances around it, and what is how do they look at that crime now, and are people supposed to be condemned forever? There are, so it is actually, one of the main ways through which we can kind of, change the discourse is when we study women's prison, to bring out the complexities of women's lives, and in ways which challenge these ideas of criminality, which challenge the ways in which the carceral state destroys people's lives and their relationships, and how it kind of glosses over this actual structural inequalities in society. Yeah, they think. I don't know if Natasha, you want to add anything? And
So there is a comment by Professor Kumkum Roy. Not a question, but a comment. Disturbing and fascinating, amazing courage, clarity, and insights. Thanks for highlighting the complexity so carefully and in such vivid detail. And also, there is another question. How do you now see your activism in the form of Pinjra Tod movement and life in prison? As in, the way we think of feminist activism and its connections to larger structures of power. Thank you.
That question is from Papuri. I'm saying that because they know her.
yeah. Thank you, Kumkum ma'am, for your comment. We are grateful. And in terms of what Papuri ma'am was asking, it is, I mean, for us, actually, it was really because we were arrested in multiple cases, like we would get bail in one case and then we would be arrested from the courtroom in another case. So after various like grueling days of police interrogation, when we actually ended up in Tihar's in Tihar, and actually there is this, it's called the DOT area where you're supposed, where you sit and then they write down give you your prison number, write down your records, do some medical tests. They actually also strip search you and then you enter the prison. And both Natasha and I think especially after that grueling interrogation and everything, it was just, we just reached prison and we couldn't stop laughing. We kind of went into this hysterical fits of laughter because the irony of, and it was still this really archaic structure. There was this huge big gate and then someone would actually literally knock and someone would come from the other side and open the lock. Like we thought it would be more mechanized or something like that. So it was the irony of being in a part of a movement which was called Break the Cage, and then to kind of find ourselves on the doors of this place which was just full of locks and walls and gates everywhere, where because one had been charged under UAPA, one did not even kind of know when we would get out. And I think it was also the political learning that we had through this journey of Pinjra Tod that also really allowed us to also, in terms of and being in that space of prison, making sense of our incarceration, gathering the courage to live that incarceration, also came from the history and the history of struggles that we had read about, and also the struggles that we as part of Pinjra Tod were able to kind of participate in. And also to kind of from the initial phase of just adjusting into the life, everyday life of incarceration, to also coming to a place where the prison itself also becomes a site of struggle for us. And after 1 year, like we organized we did a play for Women's Day in prison, and where we had the play had to be toned down because it had to be presented in front of administration, but it had characters like Savitri Bai and there was Fatima Sheikh and Jhalkari Bai and all different historical characters, and talking about questions of on women's issues. And more than what the script itself was, it was the process of coming together and connecting with our co-inmates and telling them about the history of Women's Day, people feeling excited about it, and and coming together to do this play. And it was actually the practice sessions and all, like sometimes after lockup there would be people memorizing their lines or learning Tor Tor Ke Bal, all these feminist songs which we learned, and some of which didn't even make it to the play. But that sense that that experience that we had of collectivizing, of feeling strength together to also feel, I mean, in prison, obviously, what you can do and cannot do, the consequences and risks of that are much more extreme. But slowly building some forms of collectivities. And actually for us, once we came out, it was also a very because very destabilizing experience as well, because given the kind of repression which happened, what it meant was that the political collectives as we knew them when we went inside had actually completely transformed and have found themselves in such weak places. Even for Pinjra Tod, it hasn't been able to actually come out of the massive attack of the repression. And especially for young women students whose families had no idea what they were up to, but who might have known Maya and Natasha's name. Like once their parents found out, people were put in forms of house arrest, which was even worse than, like, at least in prison we were together. And sometimes people were so isolated in their homes with their phones and laptops being taken and everything. So for us, it has actually been a process of kind of regrouping, reconnecting, making sense of, when such, and especially in the context of these arrests were also made in a way to kind of send a message to, which we see as two purpose. One is to kind of punish the Muslim community for daring to even protest. And secondly, to also send a message to the student movement, because since 2014, one of the main voices of opposition has been the student movement. So the stakes of participating in the student movement has also now, that you can be charged under UAPA, even if, even as a student, has been massively kind of, so even particularly for women students to join politics, and we are still in touch with people, and now it is a, from a highly visibilized form of protesting. Now it's also kind of, reconnecting, rebuilding, and but I don't know if that answers fully Papuri's question, but just kind of sharing some thoughts. But maybe Natasha can.
Yeah, I mean, adding just a bit to that, in the sense that for us, even while being in Pinjatod, we were always kind of alert to, like whether we were protesting against the curfew timings or, like, sexual violence inside universities. We were always tried to be alert to the larger structures of power and oppression, which were, kind of informing these things even inside the space of a university or any other space. So, like, when we were also say, for example, how do you imagine life after the curfew? So you start thinking about what kind of spaces, what kind of cities there should be, which will, enable a free society in that sense, or thinking about Brahminical patriarchy and how that is what is embodied by the university administration, in formulating of these rules and restrictions. So it's not just about one space or one struggle, but how these are also very much connected to each other. And after being through incarceration for, like, participating in the anti-CA struggles, for us that has become even more, like, alive for us, and for, as Devangana was saying, in the present scenario, doing any kind of activism, you have to confront directly the state's power, so those kinds of connections have become even more visible and much more stronger. So, like, when now also, like, we speak to students who are in the university and want to organize, everybody is just like, but how do we do this without, like, being confronted with the state's penal regime and power and police, and the thing is that you can't. So you have to, even in your very everyday level of activism, even in organizing a seminar, a talk, you have to think about all these structures, how they are also, like, informing your everyday life, not just in terms of certain movements, but also your everyday life and everyday activism. And we are still grappling with it, and it's not like we have some answers, but I think there has to be a lot of rethinking, collective rethinking, around how to rebuild our spaces and movements in line with the current scenario. And yeah, I don't know if again that also really speaks to what you were saying.
So there are two more questions. One is by Rajeshwari. How to define the morality of women in crime and punishment in the times of colonial discourse towards reforms in caste Indian societies? And the second one is by Chitran. How do you see the future of application of UAPA when there is an increasing clampdown of dissent against even thinking against structures of oppression.
Can Rajeshwari elaborate on the question a little bit? I'm a bit confused exactly. I don't know, Natasha, did you get it?
I also thought I'll say the same thing. If can be, if they can or write
yeah.
whatever is more convenient.
Rajeshwari, could you please unmute your microphone?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, it is
Yeah, we
audible
can hear
now.
you. Yeah.
How the caste Indian society laws and regulations defines morality connected crimes and punishment focused on women. That is my question, ma'am. Hello,
Hello.
is it clear?
Your voice kind of cut off, but I think I got the gist. No, I mean, I think what we were also trying to bring out through the paper was this question of how our prisons are also kind of predominantly constituted by, lower caste women, by Dalit women, by Muslim women, and in that sense, the prison is also inherently a structure which kind of reproduces the structures of caste, of patriarchy, of discrimination and oppression on the basis of religion, and things like that. So in that sense, like and also often the kind of uh, tag or the discourse of immorality is also often kind of placed in Dalit women's bodies in terms of they're and whenever they are transgressing, say, the boundaries of the domestic, or when you are transgressing the domestic to labor as laboring bodies, or various forms of transgression, which also the ways in which morality and immorality get defined, and even in the colonial as well as in the post-colonial state, is laden by structures of caste, quite what's it called, intimately. Natasha, can you continue this? I have to just get the door.
Yeah, I think Devangana kind of said it, and I think the only thing I'll add to it maybe is that you're also talking about the discourse towards reforms in caste society. And if we look at that history also, the question of morality was very, very central to that. And actually, like the history of incarceration and development of prisons in India, and the kind of criminal law, the modern criminal law, is also very, very much intimately tied with designating certain castes as criminals. The Criminal Tribes Act and the so it, from the very what I'm trying to say, from the very inceptional moment of the rule of law in India, it has been based on distinctions of caste, by designating like whole populations and communities as criminal, and through that defining the non-criminal, and their criminality was around, of course, like certain acts, but also like their whole being, the lifestyle which they symbolize, they inhabited, the immorality of that they're not settled into the tax-paying heteronormative family structure. That goes to the very heart of the inception of modern law in India, in that sense. So it is very, very much part of how crime is constituted in our society.
Thank you. Thank you,
Often a
sir.
lot of the women we met were actually, people who would brew what is called, like, local liquor or something like that. which is part of like, practices of their, and which is often also lower caste women. And just that activity itself is criminalized, and so many, it's considered a petty crime. So people get bail soon, but you just have so many people coming in and out on those crimes so often. And even like, when it's, even though it's a small crime, again, because of the issues which is designated as a small crime, because of the issues which we mentioned earlier, even on these charges, people often end up like, some people who might have some connections might leave prison in like a day, but like, many people would stay on for like months before they are able to get bail. There's the question on the future of application of UAPI.
Yeah.
Sorry, I just yeah. So I mean, I think future of application of UAPA, I think we are just going to see it being applied more. I'm sorry. Yeah. Basically, I don't have power, so I have to use my phone, and someone is going to call. So yeah, I would see it getting applied even more and more. And what has been like, earlier student, a student activism has been, or protests have been defined as terrorism. Now journalism is also terrorism. So in that sense, and the irony of this all is also how like, people must have read how the government is kind of celebrating how it, how it is going to completely decolonize, the legal system and bring in these like new laws, and how they are, they are basically getting rid of this colonial sedition law. But actually the question is, you don't need sedition anymore, because you have UAPA, which is even more stringent and which makes bail even more difficult. And in the new kind of, because they are completely revamping the CRPC and everything, in that the new laws which are being brought basically is quite similar or even worse than worse than the sedition law. So this is only incarceration through use of these laws, and maybe even many newer worse laws is what we are going to see in the coming future.
The
Uma
questions
was
are over.
here. I'm sorry, I was going to call on her, but I think she has exited. I'm sure she will write to you. We had spoken, and she had said she'd be here today, and she was. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, Akshita.
Yeah, the questions are over right now. So I think we can conclude the session. Thank you, Devangana, and thank you, Natasha, once again for your wonderful talk. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
For having
Thank you
us.
so much.
Thanks a lot. But if there's
long
anybody, we still have another 10 minutes or so. So if there are people who want to just ask without typing in, this is the last sort of call for any questions, if there are any other questions or comments or remarks or anything. And if there are not, once again, many thanks. It's not easy to come and relive many of these things, I'm sure. But I'm very moved by the way in which you can reflect on what must be such a difficult time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.